Hello, I'm Paul Behrman, and this is Talking About The Who, a new podcast dedicated to that nice rock and roll band from Shepherd's Bush, London. Welcome to episode 5 of season 1, featuring my conversation with Keith Moon biographer Tony Fletcher. Or should I say episode 5 of series 1? Because series is what us Brits are supposed to say, and I was pulled up on using the word season quite recently. But when I think what America has given us Brits over the years, rock and roll, McDonald's, Batman, The Sopranos, I think I'm happy to take the word season from you Americans too, and I think I'm going to keep using it for the podcast, for now at least. So big apologies to my fellow Brits who prefer the word series. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on whatever app you're listening on. And if you'd like to gain access to semi-regular bits of bonus content, head on over to patreon.com/talkingaboutthewho to find out more. We'll get to my conversation with Tony Fletcher shortly, but first, I'd like to talk about The Who's first single, released as The Who, I Can't Explain, because the day this episode comes out, 15th of January 2025, is the 60th anniversary of that single being released here in the UK. I've spoken before about a league table of the biggest bands of all time, with the Beatles occupying the top spot and the Rolling Stones following closely behind, with The Who battling with a few others for third place. The Beatles kick-started their singles career in 1962 with Love Me Do, a rather lightweight pop song compared to what came soon afterwards. The following year, the Rolling Stones offered up their first 45 in the shape of the Chuck Berry cover, Come On. And it would be another 2 years and 5 singles before they released their first original single. But The Who's first release set the trend for what was to come from the band over the next 60 years and, in an instant, established their identity. I Can't Explain was not a traditional love song in comparison to what the Beatles and the Stones and everyone else at that time was churning out. The Who were operating on a whole different level, and through his lyrics, Pete Townshend was going deeper into the teenage mindset than anyone had ever gone before. The protagonist of I Can't Explain may not have been dealing with hormonal teenage angst alone, but also something more chemically induced, which would have struck a chord with the mod audience that The Who were holding a mirror to at that time. As the band's audience gradually increased beyond the mods of West London, Pete Townshend would continue to write songs about the human condition throughout the next 6 decades. The protagonist in I Can't Explain could just as easily be the young boy getting off on pictures of Lily. He could be Jimmy from Quadrophenia. He could even be the narrator looking back on his life in I Don't Want to Get Wise from The Who's most recent album released in 2019. It's difficult to imagine Paul McCartney opening his live sets with Love Me Do, or the Stones starting their gigs with Come On. But I Can't Explain has likely opened more Who shows than any other song, and that opening E chord from Townshend has always been enough to get pulses racing. The Who's first single still stands up today as an integral part of their catalogue, and it continues to speak to people both young and old. Not bad for the third song Pete ever wrote. I asked a few other people for their thoughts on I Can't Explain to include in this episode. Author Chris Charlesworth kindly shared with me this extract from his book, The Complete Guide to the Music of The Who. I Can't Explain, a shameless attempt at copying the riff style of the Kinks, is nevertheless an explosive debut by The Who, a song about the frustration of being unable to express yourself, not just to the girl of your dreams, but in a broader sense, to the world at large. Roger spits out the words in unresolved frustration. Pete slashes down on characteristic power chords against John's pneumatic bass, and Keith announces his presence on the British pop scene with machine gun drumming light years ahead of any of his peers. Perhaps the best testament to Can't Explain is that for long stretches of their career, The Who opened their live shows with this song, occasionally alternating it with Substitute. Is there any other band in the entire history of rock whose first single was so good, so timeless, that they could use it to open their sets on stage for so many years? Ethan Fisher from the Who-based YouTube channel The Fisher Protocol, and one of the special guests in our next episode, had this to say. This is the ultimate live Who number. It's the beginning. It signals that, for the next 2 hours, nothing else matters. There are no valleys, just miles and miles of peaks, and this is the first one. Just as Won't Get Fooled Again is the ultimate climax to a perfect night, I Can't Explain is the perfect beginning. It's not just kick-ass, it distills all of Townsend's work down to its essence. For 60 years, through him, we've been trying to understand what's inside us. We analyse, dissect, discard, and rediscover the things that make us happy, sad, angry, or confused. But for right now, at this moment, there are no words for it. I can't explain. I also asked Dante DiCarlo, guitarist in tribute band Who's Next, for his thoughts on the Who's debut single. Pete Townshend has often described I Can't Explain as a rip-off of You Really Got Me, but personally I've never thought it was close enough to be called a rip-off. Pete might have been inspired by that song, but the result is different, with the distorted chords of the Kinks hit replaced with chiming Rickenbacker 12-string guitars and Pete's own sense of rhythm. One of the things I love about the song is how the Who managed to keep it relevant to whatever stage of their career they were in, carrying on with it in the set, usually as the opener, for pretty much their entire career. How many bands could change as much as the Who and somehow still find a place for their debut song at every show without it sounding awkward? The original version is an amphetamine-fueled dance number, but by the late 60s it had become slower and heavier, and in the 2000s it seemed to become an even harder rocking track. A big thank you to Chris, Ethan and Dante for sharing their thoughts on I Can't Explain for this episode. I now need to take a moment to talk about Shel Talmy, the man who produced I Can't Explain, as well as the Who's next two singles and debut album, and who sadly died in November. I was due to interview Shel on 14th of November, which turned out to be the day after he died, and this particular episode would have featured that conversation, which I thought would be perfect to coincide with the Can't Explain anniversary. Though he's often portrayed as one of the villains in the Who's story as a result of their legal dispute in 1966, with Talmy continuing to receive royalties on all their studio output for the next 5 years without lifting a finger, he undoubtedly played an integral role in capturing the Who's early maximum R&B sound on record, and was a big part of their springboard to stardom. Just how different would the Who's career have been without Shel Talmy producing those early recordings? I feel sad that I didn't have the opportunity to interview Shel, but I feel grateful for simply being in the position to have had some back and forth communication with him. And I think that as long as people continue to listen to the early Who and Kinks, I've no doubt that his legacy will remain strong. R.I.P. Shel Talmy. Let's now switch our focus to today's special guest, Tony Fletcher. So who is Tony Fletcher? I don't think it's possible to go through everything Tony's achieved throughout his career without this episode running for about 4 hours, but let's at least cover the basics. He's likely best known to Who fans as the author of the seminal biography on Keith Moon, Dear Boy, or Moon as it's known in the US. Tony's also written books on The Clash, R.E.M., Echo and the Bunnymen and Wilson Pickett amongst others, as well as the memoir Boy About Town, which tells of his formative years in the pre- and post-punk music scenes of London. He created the Jamming fanzine while still at school in 1977, and over the following 9 years of the fanzine's lifespan interviewed Pete Townshend twice, U2 and Paul McCartney to name just a few. He was a member of the band Apocalypse, who supported the Jam on their final tour, and he currently plays in both Hudson Palace and the Dear Boys. He publishes twice weekly on his Substack page, tonyfletcher.substack.com, and has hosted several podcast series. He's also a former New York nightclub DJ, Rock Academy director, TV presenter, journalist. Yeah, I think that's the basics covered. Our conversation was recorded remotely in November, and there's so much more I could have talked with Tony about. But for this episode, our main focus was his Keith Moon biography, although we also spent a bit of time talking about his work with the Rock Academy and playing with his band, the Dear Boys. And if you want to hear Tony's thoughts on various Who-related topics from a fan's perspective, these are included in a bonus episode, which is available to our higher tier supporters at patreon.com/Talking About The Who. And so, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Tony Fletcher. Yeah, I'll start off by talking about something you're involved in called the Rock Academy. And you've recently put on a show based around the Who. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what exactly the Rock Academy is and everything?
Yeah, absolutely. The Rock Academy is really, it was originally started by somebody who apparently the School of Rock movie was based on, a guy called Paul Green up in Woodstock, up here in the Catskills in the Hudson Valley of New York. And he moved up here temporarily and started this school. And it's called an academy, but really anybody can join. And we have a mixture of kids who have literally never held an instrument before, and some people who come to it with quite a bit of experience. And the age range is also 8 to 18. And so you get a vast range of students in there. And it's run now by husband and wife team Jason Bowman and his wife Acacia Ludwig, and they do an amazing job. And we actually put on 5 shows per season. And I typically direct 1 show per season. And finally got the chance to direct a show of, my favorite group, The Who. And we did that one over the summer. We have 10 rehearsals. Jason puts together a 24-song set list, which is long. 2 sets of 12 songs. And it's the director's job to take the kids who are meant to learn the songs outside of rehearsals, but to take the kids, they rotate in and out. There was about 24 kids as well. They rotate in and out of different songs. They'll be playing different instruments, singing, whatever, and turn that into a show that we sell tickets for 2 nights that hopefully is worth the ticket price, and not just for the parents and siblings and family, friends. And so I finally got to do a Who show, and I think there's a little bit of be careful what you wish for, because I asked for a whole bunch of favorite songs, and only when we started doing them did I realize how incredibly complicated they were and how hard it was to work out the sounds and where they came from on some of them. Just to give you a quick example, Joined Together, which was probably the first song I ever heard by The Who, though it took me years to track down a copy. Really weird sounds on there. Not just, there's synth, but there's another synth, and there's what's apparently a jaw harp, and there's a harmonica, and they're all kind of interwoven. And when you're trying to replicate that with the equipment you have, and especially with kids, it's actually, it's quite a task. But when you get it right, when we get it right, we really get it right. And I did share out a performance of Won't Get Fooled Again from when we did our best of season, which is what it says it is. You take the 5 shows, 5 songs from each show. And that one was at the Woodstock Playhouse, which is a proper theatre. And the sound was way better there than it was in the venue where we did our own particular weekend. But that performance was great. And to replicate the keyboard sound, I was able to do it with my doubling up 2 of my own keyboards with MIDI. If people know what that means, it's just like basically syncing 2 keyboards together. But then I assigned 1 other kid to literally stand on the keyboard that has knobs. It's a digital version of analog keyboards, and slowly twist the filters so that we got that filter sound. So his job was literally this like 10-year-old kid stand in front of the keyboards and twist the filters. The kids loved the music. They really, really did. And just as a very interesting thing, at the very first week, I asked them all, if they knew anything about The Who, or if they had a favorite song. And, a lot of them are very young kids and they didn't know much about The Who. But the favorite song, easily by a mile, was Behind Blue Eyes.
That's interesting.
It is. I don't know if it just speaks to a certain age group, if it was easier to get their heads around. It's one of the handful of songs I know that is considered the sort of perennial in Pete's catalog. And it was the one that when I asked them, what if you don't know anything about The Who, you've got nothing to tell me about The Who, just tell me, I want to know you've listened to the set list. What's your favorite song? And unless they just decided to copy each other. But I don't think they did. It was Behind Blue Eyes.
Yeah, my first thought was it might be because of the Limp Bizkit cover, but even that was probably 20 years ago. So
I know. It's weird how music has sort of slowed down like that. You ask some of these kids their favorite band, and they're as likely to say something like Limp Bizkit, your favorite current band, and they'll name a band that is so much like would have been the equivalent of me naming Frank Sinatra in 1977. Bands that have been around 30 years or so already. I'm like, you're 12. You're 14. Name me a band that just formed last week I haven't heard of, a band that's just got one album out that I need to know about.
How long was the rehearsal period? Because you've kind of touched on it yourself, but the Who's music is not the easiest to try and learn.
It's a 10-week. We have 10 rehearsals, and the summer season. I mean, I appreciate you asking about this, and I hope this is a great entry point for people who are probably thinking, when are we going to talk about Keith Moon? Because I love it. I love being able to pass on what very limited knowledge I may have. And, one thing I have from being a musician, but also writing about music, is understanding how songs are constructed, how we break them down, what instruments are there. I can usually, the arrangement, I can usually hear all those things. The summer seasons are hard because kids come and go. It's just the reality. They go on holiday and they are allowed to miss rehearsals. So you very rarely get a rehearsal where everybody is there. And when you're dealing with music of the complexity of the Who, that makes it particularly challenging. And I have to say, you think about it, you've got what, for my money, is the greatest drummer of all time. Certainly, by most people's accounts, the wildest. You've got what, for many people's money, is the greatest rock bass player of all time. Certainly one of the fastest and most sort of complex. And for all that I tend to think of Pete as a rhythm guitarist, he's such a good guitarist that there are all these little things go on, even when he's just playing rhythm, that if you're trying to catch those little inflections and those little licks, the little bits he throws in at the end of a line, there's a lot there. And that's before you get to Roger's powerful voice. And that's before you get to figuring out, what is that synth sound on Who Are You? And where did it come from, and how do we reconstruct it? So it was, for me, it was an especially hard show, but it was very rewarding. The kids loved it. The costumes they wore were just fantastic. It was really funny to see on like one particular song that there would be like 3 Roger Daltrys from 3 periods in his life on the stage, none of them older than 12. And then, you got some really good there's an amazing drummer who I actually used with my own band who just delivered on every song. And that clip of Won't Get Fooled Again that I shared, he's the drummer. And at least one person who saw it wrote to me and said, hang on, who's that drummer and how old are they? And that kid just turned 15 since the show. So
wow,
there are great musicians out there on the way up.
And he records with your band.
Well, I did use him with the Dear Boys when I tried recording here and having my partner in the band then add his vocals in the UK. And it was this kid, Leo. His name's Leo Beaumont. I'm sure great things will happen for him. It was his very, very first time in the studio. He did a great job. I just didn't actually love the experience of not being in the studio with my bandmate. And so going forwards, we're going to keep recording when I go over to the UK. And we've actually got it's a sort of Who modish connection, because our drummer now is Buddy Ascot, who was in the Chords, and the Chords were about as close as the mod revival scene came to a decent Who band, and Buddy is very much a Keith Moon obsessive, so there's a continuation there.
Oh, sounds great. And you just released is it a double A-side single you've just released?
Yeah, we did. We did it on this one on a CD, which obviously defies the double A-side logic, but it also doesn't. The 2 songs, Gone Viral and Scan Me, are very much about our digital culture that we live in. And I like the idea that therefore they'd be on a CD. And whole separate conversation, but we'd put out 2 7-inches before, and they cost a fortune in small runs. And each time we were disappointed with the actual quality of the cut we got back. Even if we'd heard it, even if we'd been promised our master, tape was absolutely fine, our master file. So this way, there is something to be said for digital. You send it out, and it's pretty hard to mess up burning a CD if you're a commercial plant.
Yeah,
But yeah, the
absolutely.
Dear Boys, we're at Bandcamp. We love what we do. It's proper meat and potatoes. We work within the three verses, middle eight. Some of that is based on an admiration for the Who and how much Pete was able to do within that pop rock framework in the 1960s. The day that I can do a middle eight like one of Pete Townshend's, I will be very, very happy. There are so many that I'm just like, how did you change to that chord? Like, how did it come to you? It just sounds perfect, and it sounds so not obvious.
Yeah, I don't think there's many bands that do better middle eights than the Who.
Really, really.
So the band's called the Dear Boys. Probably don't really have to think too hard about where the name comes from.
That's a perfect segue, isn't it? It was my partner's wife who came up with it. She said, "Why don't you just call yourselves the Dear Boys? Because that's what you are." And she knew about the book, and we were like, "That kind of works, yeah."
Yeah, great stuff. So what was the obviously being a Who fan is one good reason to write a book about Keith Moon, but was there anything else that kind of compelled you to write it?
Yeah, very, very much so. A lot of a lot of your listeners will have read the book, so they'll know the ending. Not just that Keith dies, but they'll know that I met him shortly before he died, and I was already an enormous Who fan, which is why I was in a room where I thought there was a chance that the Who might show up, which was the opening day of the Who's Who sort of fans exhibition at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, in August 78. And I went on the opening day, sort of hoping that, thinking that members of the Who might show up because they were kind of band who had a connection with their fans. And Pete and Keith both did. And I met Keith there. He was really, really nice to me. And I'd already seen them at Charlton, which was the last time he ever played England in 76. And I was just like a massive fan already. And he died just like a few weeks later, just within the month. And it just stuck with me through the ensuing years that here was this man who was written into history as Moon the Loon, out of control, animal from the Muppets kind of character, total drunkard, died from an overdose of pills. And I couldn't equate that with the person who'd been so sort of gentle and sweet with me, and it basically said, oh, we'll come around and see me sometime, bring your fanzine, and we'll have a natter. And I just, as I got a bit more experience with my writing, and I had two books behind me that were pretty good, the Echo and the Bunnymen and the REM biographies, I just kept coming around to Keith's life story is going to be Tears of a Clown. I mean, it's just got to be. Can I write this? Am I capable of it? Do I have what it takes? And I just kept coming around to, if not me, sort of Who, and if not now, when? And maybe this is the book I should set out to write. And maybe I need to take an enormous leap in my own an enormous leap of faith in my own abilities and set out to write this book. So that's what I did.
I think I'm right in saying it took the best part of 4 years to write, including all the research involved.
Yeah, it may have only been 3. I got asked a lot as soon as it came out how long it took me to write, and I've always been a bit embarrassed by the answer because it didn't actually take that long to write. But the reason it didn't is I sort of locked myself away and did nothing else but write the book for about 9 months. I had a little kid who would have been blah, 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 like 2 years old when I was writing it. But I basically cut off a social life. I stopped playing football with the gang in New York. I was putting in 12-hour days and then sort of 14-hour days. And by the end of it, like 18 and 20-hour days. And I think some of that comes across. You can feel that the author is like really deep into the character, really immersed. And I've never actually done a book again like that. It was like doing a fanzine in the old days where you've got a deadline and you've got 10 pages to finish and you just know you're going to stay up all night. But it was like that for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. And after that, I kind of recognized that was like a mountain that I had climbed. And in future, I've probably gone on the wrong metaphor there, but I was going to put in like more regular work days and take the evenings to regain my sanity.
So I'm guessing it was a process that did have an effect on your mental health, because obviously you're dealing with such a complex topic and not the happiest of stories either, ultimately.
And it got less happy, Paul, as it went along. That was the problem. And unlike, I went back into similar territory with Wilson Pickett, but I was both prepared for Wilson Pickett, having written about Keith Moon, and Wilson Pickett had this sort of lovely little Renaissance redemption before he died. So he had the rise, he had the fall, and then he had a little comeback and a little a nice little period. And then unfortunately he didn't live long enough to make more of it. But with Keith, it was this gradual, almost like peaking very early, if not commercially, in his life and his happiness and his sobriety. And then just this long descent. And of course, I knew the ending. The ending is he dies. So there was no happy ending coming up. And yeah, it was definitely a difficult place to go. And if the book is all the better for that, great. But it wasn't a process that I finished Keith Moon and went, okay, what other potentially, potentially mentally, I want to use the right words here. I mean, Keith, and in modern parlance, we would all agree Keith had mental health problems. We would talk about them now. Back then, sort of saying mental meant you were totally mad, unless you were saying it in a slang way. And I guess what I'm just trying to say is I didn't want to come out of writing about Keith and his problems and say, okay, which other rock star who had enormous mental health issues should I now go and spend a similar amount of time writing about and immersing myself in? And not least because The Who was my favorite band and Keith was the character that I felt I could tell their story through because I wanted to tell Keith's story.
Yeah. Do you feel that The Who and maybe the people connected with them, for example, the management, do you think they maybe could have done more to help Keith, I guess, through the whole time they knew him, really? As you say, nowadays we would recognise it's maybe mental health issues, but do you think they maybe could have done more, or do you think it was?
I think yes and no. The yes side is that everybody always asks themselves, what could I have done differently? Everybody. Even if you lose a parent to illness, I mean, I think everybody's always kind of second guessing themselves. It's very hard to help people who won't help themselves. The annoying thing is that at the end, Keith was trying to help himself. And I don't hold any responsibility. I wouldn't accuse anybody around Keith that was involved in management or his bandmates or his family. Unfortunately, he'd had one falling out too many with Dougal Butler. And Dougal had saved his life a number of times. And the guy that was with him at the end, I did go back and I was looking at some of my transcripts because I put up transcripts from the book interviews on my Substack here and there and now and then. And I was looking at what Bill Kerbishley said about this guy who was with Keith at the end. And Bill's not one to mince words. And he called him some pretty bad things. And I don't know that person well enough, but he did not have the knowledge of Keith the way that Dougal did, and he didn't probably have Keith's happiness, future, and his life, understood in a way that might have kept Keith from his final overdose. But it's still very, very difficult when somebody's used to just popping an awful lot of pills to stop them having an awful lot of pills on hand. And to that extent, it was down to Keith. One other thing I often retort with this, I feel that a lot of people tried really, really hard to keep Kurt Cobain alive. Everybody knew he had problems. Everybody knew he had heroin issues. Everybody knew he was, there was a possibility of him killing himself. They couldn't keep Kurt Cobain alive. And that was with considerable attention on doing so. And that was decades down the line. We may be at a place now where musicians are more likely to just say, I'm coming off the road. Screw you if you bought tickets. I've got a mental health issue. But in those days, it was still the first generation of rock. And there's a lot we didn't know then that we know now.
And I guess there's also the fact that the Who themselves was still in their early to mid 30s, so still young men, and probably maybe there was a sort of maybe a lack of understanding of what they could do to help someone like Keith.
Yeah, I've had friends who have had addiction issues, who've been very needy, very demanding, and it's all right up to a point, and then if you start getting your own family and you're kind of settling down in your own life and you're being more, at least a little bit more sensible. I've never been that sensible, but a little bit more sensible. It gets a little tiring as well. And I can't hold that against any other member of the band who was trying to raise a family, and Keith is off in Malibu living his fantasy lifestyle. People looked after Keith when he came back to London. Harry Nilsson gave him use of his flat. Pete believed at the time that staying off the road was the right way to keep Keith alive. It's hard to know. Keith died before that, he died before Pete might have changed his mind and gone back on the road. I think everybody was concerned. Everybody was trying their best. And I still don't, more than is clear from the book that I wrote back in 97. Yeah, wrote it in 97. I really don't think Keith intended to take his life. And I just think it was he did something he'd done before, which was to take a lot of pills in the expectation that he would be caught convulsing or whatever. He would be taken to hospital. He'd have his stomach pumped. And within that would be a sort of validation by the people who saved his life that his life was worth saving. And that's a very sad way to be for somebody who was such a rock star, such an icon, and could be such an incredibly lovable human being. But there's just, and I recognize some people might say, how do you know? And I could only say I really, really, really investigated his life, talked to a lot of people, and there was incredible insecurity there, which is just crazy of itself when you think about what he was capable of and how incredible he was. But there was a lot of insecurity there, and I just think he just popped a bunch of pills and figured, well, I've always woken up in the past. And he just didn't wake up this time.
And what's also astonishing, just staying on this for a few more moments, is the doctor who you write about in the book, Jeffrey Diamond, who prescribed him heminevrin, which is a brand name for a compound called chlormethiazole, I believe, and used to treat alcohol withdrawal symptoms. But from what I understand from reading Dear Boys, that heminevrin shouldn't be mixed with alcohol under any circumstances, but for some reason Keith was prescribed 100 of these tablets and not supervised by a medical professional in any way. and ultimately the cause of death was an overdose of heminevrin. And it's just astonishing how that was allowed to happen, I guess.
It is. There were. I mean, you probably know the Beatles song "Dr. Robert."
Yeah.
It was written about a real. I believe his name may have even been Dr. Robert. It was. I mean, all the rock stars had their doctors who would prescribe them kind of whatever they wanted. There was clearly maybe everybody felt invincible for a while, and the doctors were making probably really good money from it if they were sort of Harley Street doctors, and a rock star would go in and just be like, I'm in desperate need of uppers. I'm going on a tour. And the next person to come in might be like, I'm in desperate need of downers. I'm going on a tour. And they would kind of walk out with a prescription. That attitude was being, I think, kind of continued. Some of that is conjecture. There is no way Keith should have been given that. It's like it's almost like a form of morphine. You know, when people are coming off heroin, you don't just. And that's not something I've actually, by the way, none of the people I've written about have had big heroin issues. So I'm not claiming to be an expert, but you don't give somebody 100 morphine pills and go, this will sort it out for you. If they've got to go on morphine, it's usually when they're in rehab, or they're coming to a clinic once a day, getting a little shot that you're trying to just bring them back to some degree of non-dependency. So yes, heminevrin was to cope with alcohol withdrawal and all the symptoms that would come after Keith had spent so many years as an alcoholic. It should have been administered under supervision, and no way should he have been allowed to have those pills at hand. And even when he was prescribed them, a person of, say, Dougal's capabilities would have had the pills in their pocket and not let Keith hold on to them himself. And that's the tragedy of it at the end, that Keith had been in similar circumstances before, probably, and Dougal would always have just said, you've had them all. Yeah, we're done. Like, you finished them, mate. And always just sort of be there to make sure Keith was not going to find a stash and do something really, really stupid. And if Keith did, and it happened 2 or 3 times, it's documented in the book, it was in front of other people so that they were able to call an ambulance, emergency services, and get him saved, get his stomach pumped if need be.
And I think you ended up speaking to Jeffrey Diamond very briefly for the book. Do you know if there was any repercussions from
no, I don't believe
for want of a better word?
I don't believe there were any repercussions. He was still practicing. I got lucky. He picked up the phone, and he definitely didn't want to hear from me. But he didn't put the phone down on me. I think he just pleaded that he couldn't really remember anything from 20 years ago, which is probably what I would do in his shoes.
Yeah, understandable, I guess. So you interviewed around 120 people for this book, I believe. Was there anyone you interviewed where, obviously we're talking about Keith Moon and there's a million stories out there, some of which are true, probably a lot of which are true actually, but did you interview anyone and think from what they were saying, this is utter nonsense, this did not happen?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think, and I think this is very, very applicable to going through life. I think in a culture we're in right now, where a lot of people hear something on the internet and want to repeat it, I'm always telling my son, trace it to the source, and don't just give me something that's already a meme. Like, I want to know where it came from. I need the reputable source. So the reason I'm saying that is you will often meet someone, and I still do, who says, oh, Keith Moon. Yeah, I had a mate who knew Keith Moon. Did you know he did this? I don't know, like jumped out of an airplane at 30,000 feet and landed in the bushes and walked away. And I would say, well, who's your mate who knew Keith, and can I speak to them? And only for me, doing this book, there were some wonderful stories. If they were like 2 people removed, I would be very careful about how much credence I put in them. And hopefully within the book, which I didn't reread, in preparation for this interview, but hopefully in the book, I would make it clear where I had some doubts. But if somebody wanted to tell me, if an Oliver Reed, if a Jeff Beck, or if Keith's wife or Dougal wanted to tell me a story and say I was there and I'm on the record, then that's fine by me. And some of the stories were pretty amazing. There, for every story that I felt wasn't true, there was a story that was true that people didn't know about.
Did you find out anything in particular that really surprised you that you didn't know before?
Yeah, I did. And unfortunately, it's not really positive. I found out when I finally interviewed Kim, his ex-wife, that he'd broken her nose three different times. That was always kept very quiet. And the realization that a picture that Primal Scream used either for artwork or in an ad campaign, the picture of Keith with sitting underneath a champagne bottle embedded in his wall. I don't know if you know that image. It's a pretty amazing image. For many of us, it's just this iconic image of rock and roll excess that you can kind of like throw a champagne bottle at a wall and see and it'll embed and you'll leave it there. Kim told me, but he was actually throwing it at me. And, when you hear something like that, that's really, really tough to hear. And you're thinking that image is just like, I always loved that image. Now it's tainted for me. His playing's not tainted. I want to be clear. I also want to be clear, because I don't want us to be negative here. I also want us to be clear that even somebody like Kim, who suffered so much, I mean, I interviewed her in front of her husband, Ian McLagan, and she had no problem sort of saying in front of Ian with them sitting there, because Ian knew Keith perfectly well. They Small Faces and the Who were two sides of a very similar mod coin in the 60s and through the 70s. She said, I still love him. I mean, I couldn't live with him, and there were awful things he did, but he was lovable, and I loved him. I just want to be clear on that. Even the people who were tearing out their hair about him, and even somebody who was hurt by him, they still knew that there was this wonderful person there. If they could just sort of eliminate the demons, which proved really hard work. But he was a lovable person. He was an amazing drummer. He did make people laugh like nobody else, and he did pull off stunts that most of us would just couldn't even get our heads around the audacity of doing them. So I just want to be really clear that without going too far down any negative paths, my admiration for Keith as a musician, as a character, as an entertainer, all of that is still there. And yes, he had his dark side, and more so than most of us.
Yeah, and speaking of the kind and thoughtful Keith, I mean, you've known it yourself firsthand. I mean, would any other musician of his standing in the rock and roll world, I guess, give a 14-year-old kid his home address to come to bring his fanzine for him to have a look at?
So. I know. It's just incredible. God, I wish I still had that sheet of paper with it on there. The way I told it in Dear Boy / Moon is absolutely the way it happened. Absolutely the way it happened. No, you're quite right. I mean, Chris Charlesworth, who was my editor on the book, who had been a journalist at Melody Maker in the 70s, massive Who fan. He will, he's obviously got his own stories, and a number of them are in his memoir, just backdated, which of course is a line from Substitute, which happens to be on most days of the week the greatest song ever. And Chris writes that he went to Melody Maker. He starts hanging out with musicians a lot. He's got a bit of power, but the bands are still the bands. He's still just a journalist. And one day Keith Moon calls him at the office and to thank him for the review. And Chris is like, nobody ever calls me to thank me for a review. And I think he said, we'll come and be my guest at the next show, something like that. And that was how they formed a friendship. So Keith had this side to him. I mean, Townsend wouldn't call somebody and say, thanks for a review. I wouldn't put it beyond Roger to call somebody to argue out a negative review, but yeah, Keith had that side to him, just this like absolute. Let me reach out on the other side of this sort of the wall. The what do we call it? Is it called the fourth wall or something? I always get that wrong. The theatre term, where you.
Yeah, when you sort of speak to the audience, you mean?
Yeah, when you're
breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, but that's it,
Yeah.
breaking the fourth wall. So there was very much a fourth wall in the 70s between fans and rock stars because they lived these amazing lives. And they did. They were most of them were working class kids who finally made money and bought themselves like manor houses and Bentleys and Rolls Royces and just lived this incredible life that those of us still growing up in Britain at that time were very envious of. And Keith would reach across that divide, very consciously so, and maybe to suggest you two could join me on this side. If I could do it, you probably could. I don't think he ever necessarily put it in as many words, but I wonder if that was somewhat in the back of his mind when he was taking time with people, always being good to the audience.
Just how drunk did you get while interviewing Oliver Reed?
Oh, it wasn't paralytic. I actually didn't get as drunk as Oliver, which amazed me because you would think that if anybody knew how to hold his drink, it would be Oliver, Ollie. But he did insist. So you're asking me because I went to Ireland to interview him, and although the offer was like we could do it on the phone, that was one of only a couple of times I got on the plane. And I did not regret it. I was like, this is going to be a unique opportunity. And it really, really was. And I actually found the cassette when I put the transcript up on my Substack page and listened back to it. And it's very, very interesting because he is all over the place from the moment we meet. That's how his mind was. He's telling 6 stories at once, and that's before he's had a drink. But he was very insistent at a certain point that, like, I was trying to be, the journalist. I'm like, no, you go ahead, Ollie. And he's like, no, you're joining me. Another beer. And I do believe at a certain point he insisted on a whiskey. I mean, I had given. We made a weekend of it in Ireland because we were in England at the time. I had the baby. It was a little golden patch of parenthood where at least I was off doing this book and doing the research, and it was like, okay, let's make a weekend of this. I mean, we had a rental car. I gave my wife the keys and said, there's every chance you'll be driving us back to our bed and breakfast afterwards. And she did. But I mean, I was able to walk out. But I do remember that when she finally came in, I think we had a mobile phone. And I was like, yeah, you can come now, come meet us in the bar. And Ollie did this thing of like baptizing my kid with beer or whiskey. It was one or the other, but he actually did. He actually like did this thing and anointed my, what would he have been, 18-month-old or 12-month-old son. It was pretty funny. And when we left, I was like, wow, he's, how's he getting home? I can't actually remember how he was getting home, but he was lovely. He was lovely. And Oliver Reed, for me, was like the number one interview. He was he loved Keith so very much, so very, very much. And I really, really, really liked Ollie. I mean, I spoke to him twice on the phone and setting this thing up. He was really nice. I was just delighted to meet him. Of pretty much everybody I met, he was probably the most incorrigible. I don't think he wanted to change. I think he was pretty clear about that. Even when I interviewed him, this is who I am. This is who I will remain. And he also went, in very sort of rock and roll circumstances, didn't he? Filming The Gladiator.
Yeah. And someone else you interviewed for the book, and it's the transcriptions were on your Substack page in 3 parts, I think, was John Entwistle at his mansion in, is it Gloucestershire?
Yeah, it is, Stow-on-the-Wold.
Yeah, what was that like as an experience?
It's a very strange one, actually, Paul. Matt Kent, who you may be trying to get on this this podcast, was really helpful with me, or for me, with the book. because he'd been doing the Who convention, and he'd a naked eye, and it had given him a lot of contacts. And he set me up with John. And at my request, I think he was up for it from the beginning. I didn't want to just go up and interview John alone. I wanted, I wanted somebody to be able to be there who could, just knew John. No, it was a strange one, because I mean, this was probably the biggest rock star cliche I had in the book. Really, was showing up at John's place on a very hot day in the middle of summer, early summer '96. And it's before the Who have played and come back together for the Quadrophenia show at Hyde Park, which would gradually set them off on becoming the Who again. And that show had probably been announced, or it would have been announced, but it was very much Pete Townshend's Quadrophenia with Roger Daltrey and John Entwistle. Nobody wanted to reform the Who quite yet. And John was very, on one hand, it was very hospitable because we're in his house, and it was everything you see in that the video. I think it's for Success Story. He had a late night. Bob Pridden was there. And he made themselves, they made themselves coffee and forgot to offer us anything. And we were like really parched. And Matt said later, I just found this interesting. He said if his girlfriend was there, his partner, she'd have been, she was used to being the host. And I think that sometimes, like, I imagine that Keith would have been very much, what can I get you, dear boy? But John was sort of like, okay, let's sit down and do this. And then him and Bobby are having black coffee. Then John opens the Remy, starts topping up the coffee with Remy. And by the end of 3 hours, he's given up topping up the Remy with coffee completely. And he's pretty blitzed and calling Pete every name under the sun. And that was a very strange one. And I held back using quite a lot of that from the book because I just didn't think it would help anything. I didn't think it was relevant to Keith's life, some of it. And and I'm glad, because band members like the Who have enough, they have enough issues with each other without somebody like me going in to stir that part of it up. But clearly he had a lot of unresolved issues with Pete that came out when he'd had a few drinks. So what is that? That's the Dr. Jimmy and Mr. Jim, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So I recently spoke to Chris Charlesworth for this podcast, and we touched on Dear Boy, because I know he was involved in getting it off the ground and released. He said he believes you regard Dear Boy as the best book you've written. In terms of everything you've done throughout your career, where does Dear Boy rank for you?
Yeah, it's funny. Chris would say that. Everybody says it for me. My mother used to say it to a point of, I'm like, well, should I just stop now, Mum? I mean, like, she'd always be comparing my latest book. Well, I still think your pinnacle is Dear Boy. I'm like, what do you want me to do, Mum? Give up? Just because you don't know the Smiths as well as you know the Who. All right. I have to answer this carefully, because I recognize, and I am incredibly proud of, the fact that Dear Boy did something that every author would like to do at some point, and I think probably most musicians, which is you transcend your audience, you transcend your core audience, and you reach other people. We knew we had a core audience with that book, and pretty much even by the day it came out in the UK, we had transcended that, and people were starting to say, you should read this book about Keith Moon if you want one rock book that tells you the story of kind of rock music, the journey, a character. It's this book. And I'm really, really, really proud of that. And its sales, particularly in the UK, reflect that. When I read it back, I do tend to really recognize that I was writing it pretty much just on, nothing stronger than caffeine. But I recognize the speed with which I wrote it. And I just feel like the 60-year-old me would like to get back at that 30-year-old me and rewrite it and edit it better and write better sentences. And yet, it's held up routinely as one of the great rock books. So in a way, what do I know? I don't think it's my best written in that sense. I think there's a lot of clumsy writing in there, but that is also maybe what you would hope for somebody like a a band might say a similar thing. Yeah, I listen back to that album and I hear its faults. The other best book I've written is the other one with boy in the title, and I love that it's almost like a partner, and yet it's so short. It's also kind of my shortest book, and that's Boy About Town. And Boy About Town, which is my memoir, which has the Keith story in there and has my love of the Who in there and my interviewing Pete in there, all my early formative years. But it's a memoir, and every chapter is super short. And I really mastered how to write those kind of stories. That book, particularly the mass market paperback, which just corrected a few mistakes, very mild ones in the bigger version. But I like the yellow cover. I like how it fits in a jacket pocket, that you could take it to the beach. You could put it in your jacket, in your dressing gown, and that you could read it in a couple of days of just like full on reading. That is the book that I'm genuinely most proud of. And I know how that this comes across sort of ego ridden, but it's the one book that I can absolutely separate myself from, even though that is me in the book, and I'm writing about masturbation and everything and all manner of embarrassing stuff. I can look at that book. I don't read it, but I can look at it and go, that is truly that book. I wouldn't change a word. And that's the only book I've ever written where I probably would not change a word. I think that book is perfect as is. And people continually find me even 10 years down the line and tell me they've read it and it spoke to them in a certain way. So that's my answer.
And there we have it, my conversation with Tony Fletcher. I had a great time chatting with Tony, and it would be amiss of me not to mention how generous he was with his time, as well as his encouragement. I was also genuinely honoured to have Talking About the Who included in a festive recommendations post that he recently wrote on Substack. And it was quite surreal to read the man who wrote Dear Boy writing about me. I highly recommend subscribing to Tony's Substack, but not because I want to return the favour, but because it's a fantastic page. He regularly shares transcripts of his interviews for the Keith Moon book, and these have so far included John Entwistle, Oliver Reed, Jeff Beck and Larry Hagman, and I'm sure there's still more gold in his archive to be released. There's also transcripts for his 2 interviews with Pete Townsend that he conducted for the Jamming fanzine, and even when Tony isn't sharing Who-related content, his articles are a joy to read. You'll find the relevant links to Tony's work in this episode's show notes. There's more of my conversation with Tony available for our higher tier supporters at patreon.com/Talking About the Who. We're releasing semi-regular bits of bonus content throughout this first season and beyond, and for just £3 or $3 a month, you too can become a higher tier supporter and have access to that content, as well as help us to make more episodes. Patreon.com/Talking About the Who. If you'd prefer to support us with a simple one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/Talking About the Who. Alternatively, you can help push the podcast to a wider audience by giving us a 5-star rating on whatever app you use to listen to us. We're also on Facebook, Instagram and Bluesky, so be sure to give us a follow. And that's it for this episode. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time, when my special guests will be Ethan Fisher and Bets Crockett from the YouTube channel dedicated to the Who, The Fisher Protocol. Until then, thank you for listening, look after yourselves, and as Roger Daltrey always says, be lucky. Goodbye.